During the takeoff phase of the flight, the pilot, Joe Kabuk, randomly slumped over dead, as White described. I looked over and his chin was on his chest. He made a loud, guttural sound, kind of a groan, and his eyes rolled back and his hands never left his lap. It was quick, it was sudden, and it was final. Luckily for the 4 other souls aboard, Kabuk did engage the autopilot directly before his own soul left his body, so there was time for an assessment of the situation. Knowing how to use the radio, White contacted Air Traffic Control, ATC, and declared an emergency, the go-to thing to do in such a scenario. In a nutshell, this basically means that from that point on, you could more or less do whatever you want in your attempt to get safely back on the ground, and ATC is at your beck and call to help in any way they can, diverting any other planes as needed. They'll also provide any information they can, getting ground emergency personnel nearby when you're going to attempt to land, and otherwise organizing help in any way possible. Though it is noteworthy here that most ATC personnel are not pilots themselves, and so there is sometimes a delay getting anyone who actually knows how to fly a plane on the line. On that note, while the initial ATC contact White found himself talking to wasn't terribly helpful, they eventually got an ATC employee, Lisa Grimm, who was a pilot herself and would go on to be an absolute superstar during the event, helping White to get the aircraft under control and otherwise helping keep him calm. Later, they were able to track down a King Air pilot, Carl Sorensen, to help with the specifics on how to land the thing. During the whole ordeal, beyond having to figure out how to fly and land the plane, White also had a bit of worry about the dead pilot potentially slumping over the controls at an inopportune moment. But efforts by he and his wife to remove said body from the pilot's seat were unsuccessful, so they simply cinched the seatbelt as tight as they could and hoped that that would be good enough. We'll spare you most of the details, as they are best just gone and listened to, other than to mention our favorite part.
Are you using the autopilot or are you flying the airplane?
I'm in the good Lord's hand flying this.
Classic Doug. Another great line during the final moments before touchdown, ATC told White,
Looks good from here, good job.
It ain't over till it's over, friend.
Remarkably, with a lot of help from his angels on the ground, White was able to land the plane not only safely, but in pilot speak, he greased the landing, meaning it was a rather gentle and uneventful touchdown and pretty much right on the center line to boot. Said the aforementioned Sorensen, who was in the back telling ATC what to tell White, I don't think you could have made the plane more complex or the pilot less experienced and have had a successful landing. When all was said and done, he was later interviewed about how he kept so calm during the ordeal, with White simply saying in his thick drawl, there were buzzers, amber lights, horns. It was like a circus. The only thing I was concentrating on was keeping the airspeed up and the wings level. You know, just fly the plane. You just focus your fear and go into a zone. There's no time to chit-chat or lock up, just get her done. If you're gonna die, at least die trying not to. And we're pretty sure that last line needs to go on a t-shirt fairly pronto. Moving on from there to some people with zero flight experience who successfully got her done, we have one Henry George Anhalt, who was aboard a small Piper Cherokee 6. As you might expect from that, it's a 6-seater plane. He was with his wife and 3 sons when the 36-year-old pilot, Christopher Pierce, died. The plane at the time was low on fuel, but thankfully only about 10 minutes from their destination of Winter Haven Airport in Florida. Shortly after the pilot slumped over, Anhalt keyed the radio and asked for help. Said Anhalt after taking the controls, I kept my mind on flying the plane on a course for Winter Haven. I started calling Mayday over and over and kept praying for Chris to revive. We made it to the airport, but we still hadn't heard from anybody. I started circling. Becky was hollering that I was going too steep, so I made wider circles. I tried switching to the full tank, but the engine would sputter, and I'd put it back on the nearly empty tank. Finally, someone gets on the frequency and says, are you the Mayday? Yes, my pilot passed out, I said. We're over the Winter Haven Airport. Then another pilot came on and said, we're close by. We'll be over to help. The person who answered the call was flight instructor Dan McCullough, who was giving a flight lesson at the time. After calming Anhalt down, he gave him his first flight lesson, and being a bit of a gentleman, he didn't even charge him. Said McCullough later, we flew down closer and got him lined up on a real good glide path to the runway. You can get anybody over the numbers on the grounds, but it's that last 5 feet that's tricky. I asked him to fly around the airport a bit to get more used to the aircraft. The only real disadvantage I had over any other time I've done it is I couldn't actually be in the aircraft with him. I just gave him directions how to get over the runway and then to cut the engine. I had to keep him level. If he came in too steep, he'd dive into the ground. If he came in too far back, he'd stall. In the end, Anholt was able to get it down, stating, "I had the flaps, or whatever they're called, up, and I idled the speed down. After that, it happened real quick." His wife added, "We bumped twice on the ground and veered a few feet into the grass." And if you're wondering, as this is often asked in these situations, at least in this case, yes, the flight instructor Dan McCullough was happy to endorse the flight and landing as Anholt's first solo in a logbook if Anholt wanted to get one. Moving on from there, we have one of the more notable cases of a person with zero pilot experience flying in one of the aforementioned Cessna 172s in 2013. The passenger, a then 77-year-old John Wildy, had been a member of the Royal Air Force for 24 years, but not as a pilot. In short, he and his friend, who went unnamed in the reports, were up flying around as they frequently did when his friend turned to him and said, to quote, "He said he was sick and asked me to take the aircraft controls. He set the controls and put me on the right path. Then he was unwell again, completely unresponsive. I called his name, but he didn't answer." As flying such a plane, in terms of keeping it straight and level, isn't actually that terribly difficult. In fact, if the plane is properly trimmed, as it apparently was, it should mostly fly itself straight and level without touching the controls at all, so there was no real immediate